When we hear the phrase, "a child hidden from the world," it sounds like the beginning of a dark fairy tale, something from an old story where an evil king locks a princess in a tower. But Genie Wiley's story is no fairy tale. It was real, and it unfolded not in some distant century, but in modern America. Genie was born in 1957 in Arcadia, California. From the very start, her life was marked by tragedy and cruelty. Her father, Clark Wiley, was a deeply disturbed man with a violent temper and an obsessive fear of the outside world. He ruled his home with an iron fist. Neighbors described him as an angry, controlling figure who barely allowed his family to breathe freely. But what he did to his youngest daughter was beyond comprehension. Genie was just a baby when her father decided that she should be hidden away. He believed she was mentally disabled, simply because she was a little slower to speak her first words. Instead of showing patience and love, he condemned her to a childhood of silence. At an age when most children are exploring, playing, and learning about the world, Genie's world became a prison. 4 walls, a crib, a potty chair, and endless darkness. Her father locked her in a small room at the back of their home. The curtains were always drawn. The door was shut tight. Inside that room, Genie was strapped to a potty chair during the day, unable to move, with her arms and legs tied. At night, she was placed in a sleeping bag and kept in a crib, often with a kind of wire cage on top to prevent her from escaping. The room had almost nothing, no toys, no books, no sounds of laughter, just silence. The silence, however, was not peaceful. It was enforced. If Genie made the slightest sound, if she whimpered or cried, her father would beat her with a stick. He even barked at her like a dog to scare her into staying quiet. Soon, Genie learned the most terrible lesson a child could ever learn. To survive, she had to be invisible. She stopped trying to speak. She stopped trying to call for help. Her voice was stolen by fear. As the years passed, Genie grew older, but she did not grow up in the way other children do. While other kids were running around playgrounds, learning words, and asking endless questions, Genie sat in silence, strapped to her chair. She could not interact with her older brother or her mother freely, because they too were terrified of the father. The whole house lived under his shadow, but Genie bore the worst of it. Isolation does something devastating to a human being, especially to a child. Children are like seeds. They need sunlight, water, and nurturing to grow. Without them, they wither. Genie was deprived of everything that makes us human: love, play, language, and touch. She was never spoken to, never hugged with warmth, never told a bedtime story. Her entire childhood slipped away in that room, hidden from the world. When she was finally discovered at the age of 13, doctors who examined her realized how much had been stolen from her. She weighed only 59 pounds, severely underweight for her age. Her body was stiff, her movements awkward. Years of confinement had weakened her muscles. She couldn't straighten her arms or legs properly because she had been strapped for so long. Her eyes, too, told the story of her suffering. People who met her described her as having a vacant, almost haunted look, as if she wasn't sure whether she was truly allowed to exist in the world. She had never seen beyond the 4 walls of her prison, so even the sky, the trees, and the sound of other people's voices were new and overwhelming to her. To think about Genie's hidden childhood is to realize the absolute cruelty of her father's choices. He didn't just deny her toys or schooling. He denied her life itself. Every child is born with potential to laugh, to play, to make friends, to dream. But Genie was robbed of all of it. She was hidden so completely that, for 13 long years, she was a ghost to the outside world. What makes her story even more tragic is that all of this abuse could have been prevented. There were neighbors, relatives, and even officials who suspected something was wrong, but nobody intervened soon enough. Genie's father was so controlling that he drove people away and kept the family in isolation. And so, Genie's cries, those early cries of a baby that wanted comfort, were swallowed by silence. When we reflect on Genie's hidden childhood, we are forced to ask ourselves hard questions. How many other children might be suffering in silence? How often do we ignore the signs because we think it's not our business? Genie's tragedy teaches us that staying silent in the face of abuse can allow unimaginable suffering to continue. Yet, even in this darkness, There is a flicker of something powerful, resilience. Despite being hidden, despite being robbed of everything, Genie survived. She lived through conditions that would break most people. The very fact that she was still alive when discovered is a testament to the human will to endure. Her childhood was stolen, yes, but her story forces the world to confront the ugly reality of child abuse and to promise never again. Genie's life became a voice for all the hidden children of the world, those trapped in silence, in fear, and in neglect. When Genie Wiley was finally rescued at the age of 13, doctors and psychologists faced a heartbreaking truth. This young girl had spent her entire childhood in near total silence and darkness. Imagine a world where your voice is forbidden, where your laughter is punished, where your very existence must remain unnoticed. This was the world Genie lived in. Her father's rules were brutal and absolute. Genie was not allowed to cry, not allowed to talk, not allowed to make a sound. If a whisper escaped her lips, if a whimper of pain or fear broke through, her father would strike her. He barked at her like a vicious dog, a terrifying warning that noise meant punishment. To avoid beatings, Genie trained herself into silence. She swallowed every sound, until silence became her only language. Think about that for a moment. For most children, silence is temporary. A pause between words, a breath before another question, a moment of wonder before shouting in excitement. But for Genie, silence was not a choice, it was a prison. During the day, she sat tied to a potty chair in a dimly lit room. The blinds were always closed, blocking out sunlight. No birdsong, no cars passing, no voices of neighbors, only the dull hum of emptiness. Sometimes, she could faintly hear her father's footsteps in the house. They were not comforting, they were the sound of fear. At night, she was placed in a crib with a wire cover, almost like a cage. She lay there in the darkness, unable to move freely, unable to comfort herself. Most children fall asleep listening to bedtime stories or lullabies. Genie fell asleep to silence, broken only by the sound of her father's anger if she dared to stir. Because she was deprived of human interaction, Genie never developed language. By 13, she knew only a few words like, "Stop it," and "no more," words that came not from joy but from pain. Her silence was not the quiet of peace. It was the silence of fear, the silence of survival. Science tells us that the early years of childhood are critical for learning language and social skills. Babies babble, toddlers mimic sounds, children chatter endlessly, all because their brains are hungry for connection. Genie never had that chance. The silence around her was not filled with conversation, music, or laughter. It was filled with nothingness, and silence, when forced, becomes as heavy as chains. Darkness was her other constant companion. Her father never allowed her to step outside, never allowed her to see the natural world. The curtains stayed drawn, the room remained dim, day and night blurred together. For Genie, the world was not colorful. It was shadowy and unclear. When she was finally rescued, she struggled to adjust her eyes to the brightness of daylight, as if the sun itself was too foreign, too overwhelming. Children learn about the world through sight and sound. They chase after butterflies, they watch cartoons, they listen to songs, they giggle at silly noises. Genie had none of that. The silence and the darkness together created a void, a childhood erased. But here is what makes her story even more tragic. Even in her silence, Genie must have longed for connection. Studies later showed that when she was rescued, she was curious about people, fascinated by new sounds, and eager to touch and explore. That means that even in her prison of silence and darkness, a spark of hope, a desire to live and connect, remained inside her. Imagine carrying that tiny spark for 13 long years, waiting for someone to notice you, to save you. The damage of silence and darkness was deep. When specialists first met Genie, she walked with a strange, bunny hop motion because her muscles had not developed properly. She spat and clawed at objects because she had not learned how to behave in a normal environment. She stared at things for long stretches of time, as if trying to memorize every detail she had been denied. And when people spoke to her, she tilted her head and listened with intense concentration, as if she were trying to drink in every drop of sound she had missed. This is the power of silence. It can rob a person of skills most of us take for granted. And this is the cruelty of darkness. It can stunt not just the body, but the mind and spirit. Yet, Genie's survival in that life of silence and darkness speaks to something profound. Most children deprived of love and contact for so long might not have made it, but Genie did. She endured. Somewhere inside her, she found a way to keep going. Her silence was forced, but her survival was chosen. Her story is more than a tale of cruelty. It is a warning and a lesson. Silence is deadly when it is imposed. Darkness is devastating when it is forced. But as human beings, we can break silence. We can open the curtains and let in the light. Genie's life of silence and darkness compels us to fight for every child's right to speak, to laugh, to play, and to live in the warmth of love and freedom. For 13 long years, Genie Wiley lived in silence, hidden from the world. But one day, almost by accident, that silence was broken. Her rescue was not the result of careful planning or heroic investigation. It happened because of a moment of desperation from her mother. In November 1970, Jenny's mother, Irene, decided she could no longer bear the abuse of her husband. Partially blind and herself a victim of years of control, Irene finally gathered the courage to escape with her daughter. She had endured Clark Wiley's tyranny for so long that leaving felt like stepping into an unknown world. With Jenny by her side, she walked into a local social services office, not fully understanding the storm she was about to unleash. The social worker who first saw Genie thought she was much younger than 13. Genie was small, frail, and underdeveloped. Her body was stiff, her face carried a vacant expression, and her clothes were dirty and mismatched. At first glance, it seemed impossible that she could be a teenager. She looked more like a toddler. The staff immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. When they asked her questions, she barely spoke. She shuffled awkwardly, moving in a strange, almost animal-like way. Her silence was heavy, but her eyes told a story wide, curious and yet filled with fear. It was clear that this was no ordinary case of neglect. Within hours, authorities were involved. Police and child welfare agents rushed to investigate. When they entered the Wiley home, the truth revealed itself like a nightmare. They found the small, dim room where Genie had been kept locked away. They saw the potty chair with straps, the crib with its wire covering, the drawn curtains that had kept out the sun for over a decade. The evidence was undeniable. This was not just neglect, but one of the worst cases of child abuse ever recorded. Genie was taken into protective custody, and her father was arrested. Faced with the shame of exposure and fearing prison, Clark Wiley made a chilling decision. Just days after Jenny's rescue, he took his own life. He left behind a short note. The world will never understand. Perhaps he was right. The world could never fully understand the depth of cruelty he had inflicted on his daughter. For Genie, though, this was the beginning of a new chapter. After years of silence and darkness, she was suddenly surrounded by doctors, psychologists, and caregivers. Her rescue captured national attention. Newspapers wrote about her, scientists debated over her future, and the public followed her story with fascination and horror. People wanted to know, could this child, trapped for so long, learn to live a normal life? Could she recover from such unthinkable trauma? Her arrival at the hospital was like a rebirth. She was examined carefully by a team of specialists who were stunned by her condition. At 13, she weighed just 59 pounds. She could not chew solid food because she had never been fed properly. She could not stand straight because her muscles had not developed normally. She knew only a handful of words, mostly negative ones: stop it, no, and more. Her childhood had been so silent that her brain had not been able to grasp language. And yet, despite all this, Genie showed signs of resilience. She was curious about her surroundings. She reached out to touch things she had never seen before. She explored objects with her hands, fascinated by their textures and shapes. She smiled shyly when treated with kindness. For the first time in her life, she was experiencing freedom. Sunlight on her skin, voices around her, human warmth. Her rescue became more than just a personal story, it became a scientific breakthrough. Linguists, psychologists, and neurologists all wanted to study Genie. She became the center of a major research project about human development. Scientists wondered, if a child is deprived of language during the early years, can they ever fully learn it later? Genie was living proof of what happens when the brain is denied stimulation at its most critical stage. But beyond the research, there was something deeply human about her rescue. Caregivers described how Genie would look at people with wide eyes, as though drinking in every bit of human connection she had been denied. She loved to play with plastic containers and pieces of cloth, touching and exploring. She delighted in simple things that most children take for granted. Each moment of discovery was precious to her. Her rescue also revealed something profound. Even after years of unimaginable abuse, the human spirit seeks connection. Genie could have shut down completely. She could have turned inward and refused to interact. Instead, she reached out, slowly but surely, toward the world that had finally opened to her. And yet, her rescue raised painful questions. Who would care for her long term? Could she adapt to life outside of confinement? Would society nurture her, or would she become a spectacle? These questions would haunt her story in the years to come. But in those first weeks after discovery, there was hope. Hope that Jenny might heal. Hope that she could learn to speak, to play, to laugh. Hope that society could make up for what had been stolen from her. Her discovery was not just the rescue of one child. It was a wake-up call to the world. It forced people to confront the reality of child abuse and the responsibility of communities to protect the vulnerable. Genie's story reminded us that silence hides suffering, and that sometimes the most important act is simply to see the unseen. For Genie, the rescue was both an end and a beginning. It ended her life of imprisonment, and it began her uncertain journey into freedom. When Genie Wiley was discovered in 1970, the world was stunned. The horror of her past was undeniable. 13 years locked in silence and darkness, robbed of childhood, robbed of freedom. And yet, when she was finally free, something remarkable began to happen. Despite all she had endured, Genie showed signs of life, curiosity, and resilience. For the first time, there was a flicker of hope. Doctors, linguists, and psychologists gathered around her, not just to study her, but to try to give her what she had never been given: care, affection, and the chance to live. What they witnessed in those first months was nothing short of extraordinary. At the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, Genie began to experience the world. She had never touched toys before, but now she explored objects with fascination. Plastic containers, cloths, beads, ordinary items that most children might ignore became treasures to her. She touched them, twisted them, studied them. To her, every sound and texture was new, and her curiosity seemed endless. Most striking of all, Genie began to smile. After years of fear, she responded warmly to kindness. She laughed when people played with her. She reached out to hold hands. She hugged her caregivers tightly, clinging to them as though afraid they might disappear. For a child who had been denied love for so long, the smallest acts of affection meant everything. Language, too, became an area of hope. Scientists wondered whether she could learn to speak, given that she had missed the critical window of early childhood when language normally develops. To their surprise, Genie began to acquire words, slowly but steadily. She learned how to label objects, how to ask for things she wanted, how to express simple needs. Her vocabulary expanded to hundreds of words within a short time. Though her sentences were never fully grammatical, the very fact that she could speak at all was astonishing. Each new word she learned felt like a victory, not just for her, but for humanity's understanding of resilience. Every time she spoke, it was as though she was reclaiming a piece of the life that had been stolen from her. But her progress was not only intellectual, it was emotional. Caregivers noticed that Genie loved being outdoors. She would tilt her head back and stare at the sky, marveling at the vastness above her. She loved the feel of grass under her feet and the warmth of the sun on her skin. These simple experiences, things most children grow up with, were brand new to her, and she embraced them with wonder. Her story soon spread across the world. Newspapers reported on her transformation, calling her the feral child or the wild child. While the sensational headlines often overlooked her humanity, they also brought attention to the possibilities of her future. Could Genie overcome her past? Could love and care rewrite the tragedy of her early years? For those who worked with her closely, there was reason to believe so. They saw her resilience firsthand. They saw how she sought connection, how she mimicked actions, how she lit up at small moments of kindness. Her very survival was miraculous, but her ability to heal, even partially, was inspiring. Genie also formed bonds with the people around her. One of her doctors recalled how she would sit quietly beside him, holding his hand as if it anchored her in a world that still felt uncertain. To her teachers, she was not simply a research subject. She was a child rediscovering life. They described her as gentle, affectionate, and eager to please. There was also a sense of mission in those early days. Researchers believed that by helping Genie, they were also advancing science. Her case could answer fundamental questions about language, learning, and human development. But beyond the science, there was something deeper: the moral responsibility to give Genie the childhood she had been denied. For Genie herself, those early years after rescue were likely the happiest of her life. For the first time, she was free. Free to walk outside, free to make sounds without fear, free to be touched with kindness instead of cruelty. She had lived through unimaginable darkness, but now there was light. Of course, progress was slow and fragile. Trauma does not disappear overnight. Genie struggled with emotional regulation. She sometimes lashed out or withdrew when overwhelmed. But those who cared for her were patient. They understood that each step forward, no matter how small, was a triumph. Looking back, these first years after her discovery were truly a brief ray of hope. It was a window of possibility where the world seemed ready to nurture her, where love and science came together in an attempt to heal the wounds of her past. Genie symbolized not only tragedy, but the strength of the human spirit. Her smiles, her first words, her wonder at the world, these moments remain a testament to resilience. They showed us that even in the face of the worst abuse in history, a human being can still reach out for connection, still find joy, still discover hope. And perhaps most importantly, her story inspired countless people to think differently about children, about abuse, and about the power of kindness. Genie taught the world that even after years of silence and darkness, the possibility of light remains. In the years following her rescue, Genie Wiley became a symbol of survival. The world had seen her smile, had watched her begin to learn words, and had celebrated her small victories. For a brief time, it seemed as though her future might finally hold happiness. But as her story unfolded, tragedy returned, not in the form of her father's cruelty this time, but in the failures of the very system meant to protect her. At first, Genie was placed in the care of researchers and foster families who seemed genuinely invested in her progress. They documented her growth, encouraged her learning, and provided the affection she had been denied for so long. But soon, a troubling pattern emerged. Genie became less of a child in need and more of a subject in a scientific experiment. The research surrounding her case was intense. Linguists, psychologists, and neurologists competed for access to her. She was studied, filmed, and tested almost constantly. For Genie, who had just begun to experience freedom, this level of scrutiny was overwhelming. Instead of the stability she needed, she was caught between the competing interests of adults who claimed to care for her but also wanted to advance their careers. At the same time, funding for her care became uncertain. Much of the support she received came from government research grants, and when those ended, so did many of the resources that had been helping her recover. Without money, the programs that nurtured Genie collapsed, and the question of who would take responsibility for her became a battle. This instability was devastating. Genie had already been through unimaginable trauma. What she needed most was consistency, a safe home, loving caregivers, and a stable routine. Instead, she was moved from one foster home to another. Each move ripped away the fragile bonds she had formed, and each new environment forced her to start over. Worse still, not all of her foster placements were safe. Reports later revealed that Genie suffered further mistreatment in some of these homes. The very institutions and families entrusted with her care sometimes failed her, repeating the cycle of neglect she had endured for so long. For a child already scared by betrayal, these new wounds cut even deeper. One particularly heartbreaking detail emerged from these years. Genie, who had once begun to speak and learn words, began to lose them again. Her language skills, fragile to begin with, regressed as her environment became unstable. The girl who had once shown such promise, who had been called a miracle of resilience, was now slipping backward, not because she lacked potential, but because she lacked the support she needed. The contrast was painful. In the hospital, under consistent care, she had thrived. She had smiled, laughed, and learned. But in the chaos of foster care, surrounded by neglect and instability, she withdrew again. The light that had begun to shine in her life dimmed, and the world watched as hope turned back into sorrow. The media, once fascinated by her progress, began to lose interest. The story of the wild child no longer seemed glamorous when it became clear that her recovery would not be simple. Without headlines to keep public attention, Genie's case quietly faded from view. The researchers who had once fought for her drifted away, their projects unfinished. In the end, the little girl who had captured the world's imagination was left largely alone. For Genie, this was perhaps the cruelest betrayal of all. After surviving her father's abuse, she had been promised freedom, care, and a chance at life. Instead, she was passed from hand to hand, her needs overshadowed by arguments over science, money, and responsibility. It was not a single person this time who failed her, but an entire system. By the time Genie reached adulthood, she was placed in a series of institutions for the mentally disabled. There, she lived quietly, away from the public eye. Very few updates about her life emerged, but what was known suggested that she never fully regained the progress she had once made. Her voice, which had begun to emerge so beautifully in those first years of rescue, was silenced again, not by her father this time, but by neglect and abandonment. The story of Genie's later years forces us to ask difficult questions. How could a society that once rallied around her so quickly forget her? How could professionals who understood her trauma allow her to be re-traumatized by unstable placements? Why did the world let her down a second time? Her tragedy reminds us that rescue is only the beginning. Saving a child from abuse is not enough. Healing requires long-term commitment, patience, and love. Genie's brief ray of hope showed what was possible when she was cared for properly. But her betrayal and neglect show what happens when society loses interest and walks away. Genie's life became a warning that children who suffer such extreme trauma cannot simply be rescued and then left to survive on their own. They need more than headlines. They need more than scientific curiosity. They need lifelong protection, stability, and compassion. And while her later years may have been marked by silence once again, the lesson of her story still speaks loudly. Genie was failed by her father, but she was also failed by a system that should have given her a second chance. Her life challenges us to do better, not just to rescue children from abuse, but to stand by them, nurture them, and ensure that hope does not fade into neglect. The tragic life of Genie Wiley is not just a tale of cruelty and neglect. It is a mirror that reflects back to us the responsibilities we hold as individuals, families, and societies. While her story breaks our hearts, it also teaches us lessons that cannot be ignored. Genie's pain must not be wasted. It must be transformed into a reason to protect, nurture, and fight for every child's right to a safe and loving life. One of the clearest lessons from Genie's story is the critical importance of early childhood. Scientists had long believed that the first years of life are the foundation for everything that follows, and Genie became living proof of this truth. Because she was deprived of language during her early years, her brain missed the critical window for developing full speech. Even after her rescue, despite all the love and effort of teachers, she was never able to master grammar in the way other children do. This reminds us that the earliest stages of life are not optional. They shape who we become. The hugs, the words, the songs, the bedtime stories we give to children are not just simple acts of love. They are building blocks of the human brain. When children are denied these, something irreplaceable is lost. When we think of abuse, we often imagine bruises, broken bones, or physical scars. Genie's story shows us that neglect and enforced silence can be just as destructive, if not more so. Her father rarely spoke to her, never hugged her, and punished her for making sounds. This absence of love, this forced silence, left scars that were invisible but deep. Genie's body survived, but her spirit was starved. The lesson here is powerful. Neglect kills dreams, it kills potential, it kills childhoods. Abuse is not always loud, it can be quiet, hidden, and disguised as strict parenting or family privacy. Genie's story forces us to open our eyes and recognize that silence itself can be a form of violence. When Jenny was discovered, the world celebrated her rescue. There was relief, joy, and even scientific excitement. But as her later years showed, rescue alone is not enough. For a child who has been through trauma, what comes after rescue is just as important as the act of saving them. They need stability, long-term care, and unconditional love. Genie did not receive that. She was bounced from one foster home to another, studied by scientists, and eventually abandoned by a system that ran out of funding and interest. This failure reminds us that saving a child from abuse is just the first step. True rescue means walking with them through the long road of healing. One of the most painful truths of Genie's story is how she became more of a subject than a person. Researchers were fascinated by her, but sometimes they forgot she was not a test case. She was a little girl who needed love, patience, and family. This teaches us that compassion must come before curiosity. Science can learn from tragedy, yes, but never at the expense of the person who has suffered. Genie needed a mother figure, a father figure, a stable home, not endless tests and cameras. For us, the lesson is clear. When we encounter children in pain, our first responsibility is to treat them as human beings, not problems to solve or projects to study. Genie's case also reminds us that abuse can hide in plain sight. Neighbors noticed strange things. Relatives sensed something was wrong, yet nobody acted until it was too late. For over a decade, Genie's suffering went unnoticed, ignored, or excused. This is perhaps the most urgent lesson. We cannot stay silent when we suspect a child is being harmed. Speaking up, reporting, asking questions. These actions can save a life. Silence from society allowed Genie's silence to continue. If even one person had intervened earlier, her life might have been very different. Despite everything, Genie showed remarkable resilience. She smiled, she learned, she reached for connection. Her spirit refused to be completely crushed. This is inspiring, but it should not make us complacent. Resilience does not mean a child can recover on their own. It means that with love, care, and opportunity, healing is possible. Genie's brief progress showed us that human beings can bloom even after the harshest winters. But her regression showed that without consistent nurturing, even the strongest spirit can falter. Ultimately, Genie's story asks us a haunting question. What kind of world do we want to build for our children? Do we want a world where abuse can be hidden behind closed doors, where victims are forgotten once the headlines fade, where systems fail the very people they promise to protect? Or do we want a world where every child, no matter how broken their beginning, has a chance to heal? Genie's life may have been filled with tragedy, but the lesson it leaves us is a call to action. We cannot change her past, but we can change the future for others like her. Genie Wiley is remembered as the wild child, the feral child, or the case study of language deprivation. But beyond those labels, she was simply a little girl who wanted love. Her story is tragic, yes, but it is also motivating. It teaches us never to turn away from suffering, never to underestimate the damage of silence, and never to abandon those who need us most. The greatest lesson of Genie's life is this: every child deserves to be seen, heard, and loved. If her suffering pushes us to protect even one child from abuse, then her story, as tragic as it is, will not have been in vain.